one popular idea that I've seen bandied about in the RPG community is encapsulated by the phrase rulings over rules. I think this is generally a pretty good attitude to have. And it seems to encapsulate a few different ideas all wrapped into one. On a very basic level, it's about making, as a GM, making decisions on the fly, making the rulings rather than taking out the book and finding a particular given rule to tell you how to do it. And it's a little bit more about trusting your gut. Another thing that's kind of encapsulated within this idea that I particularly agree with is more of a fiction first attitude, in the sense that, well, does it make sense that this would work out, rather than seeing like, oh, what save does this guy have to roll against this effect, and how many damage dice is it? It's just like, oh, you pushed him off the ledge of the cliff, he's gonna die. That's actually a pretty good example, where it's like, instead of looking up like how many d6 of falling damage does the guy have, when you push the villain off the cliff, he falls to his death. The end. And so I agree with all of that. I think that's a pretty good approach to things, but I also think that it's a little incomplete. And I would suggest a slight refinement to it, because part of the reason that I think it's incomplete is that it doesn't offer that much practical advice, especially to newer GMs. If I tell a new GM, like, there are some, it depends a lot on one's personal abilities and temperament. There are some new GMs that I can say, don't be afraid to just make up a ruling and go with it. You don't need to look everything up in the rules. That will be greatly empowering to some people, and that's the exact piece of advice that they need. But for a lot of people, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think for a lot of people, this is actually more terrifying than it is useful. Just go with the flow, man. And it's like, but what even does the right answer look like? And you can say, you're thinking about it wrong. There is no right answer. The right answer is whatever you want to do with it. But again, for a certain type of person, that is the antithesis of comfort and help. A little bit of guidance goes a long way sometimes. The other problem is that it depends what kind of system you're running too. There are some systems that are just much more compatible with a rulings over rules mindset. Whereas, for instance, perhaps some player comes up to the new GM and says, hey, I really appreciate when I can play a role where I'm like consistently dealing damage, even if it's not a lot. So, hey, I've got a lot of this crafting skill. Can I make my weapon, like, give a modification to it so that it's like super accurate, but at the cost of damage? Is that something that I could do? And the GM probably will think like, oh yeah, that's a fair trade-off for sure, man. Let's do it. That sounds like a lot of fun. But then they don't realize that the entire game is built around getting crits, and crits are like disproportionately super effective in that game because they haven't run it enough to realize that that's a thing. And so all of a sudden they've accidentally made like the most OP character possible, because even though in theory the damage is low, like crits like can quadruple the damage, or there's like a million feats that actually like work off of crits. And it's like, you crit someone, and then if you have the right build, you can stun them and deal quadruple damage and disarm them, and the next attack gives advantage against them. Granted, that's probably a pretty silly design, but you could imagine a system where it's like getting extra accuracy is the whole point, and like this guy gets bonus to accuracy by being like super fast and positioning in the right moment at the right time. This guy gets extra accuracy through being stealthy and getting the sneak attack, and this guy actually sacrifices an action to get bonus accuracy and stuff, and then you accidentally gave this other guy something that is disproportionately powerful. But it made sense in theory in the fiction. Like, sure, why not? Something that's more accurate but less damaging, like that's not an outrageous suggestion by any means. In fact, one could argue that in fictional terms, usually weapons that are more accurate also tend to be very damaging, because it's like, if I hit him in the face, it doesn't really matter that usually it doesn't do a lot of damage. I hit him in the face. If I hit him in the eye hole, it's going to the brain. It doesn't matter, like the fact that it's a tiny little dagger. Okay, but I stabbed him in the face. Like, technically, I guess a giant, big ol', like, mega axe to the face technically will do more damage, but it's kind of a moot point. And so there's a little bit of system compatibility as something to keep in mind there. But even more importantly than that, I think, is you need some practical applicability. You need some guidelines to be able to give to GMs as to how to do things. And so my suggestion for a refinement, granted it's not as catchy, but my suggestion would be toolbox over rulebook. In other words, what you want to do, the purpose of an RPG rulebook, in my opinion, is different from both the sort of OSR mindset and the sort of 4E influenced gamist mindset, if I can coin a bad phrase. Because those are kind of two, there's not a single spectrum, there's many different spectrums, but those are two ends of a spectrum, let's say, within the RPG community. And I was kind of already describing a sort of what I call 4E gamist mindset with that example game that I was giving. These are sort of games that have very tightly balanced, usually combat rule sets. It can be more than that. I'm thinking of Draw Steel, for example, though I don't know a ton about that game, and I know it does have, for example, social systems, not just combat, but it does seem to be very heavily combat influenced. I've been recently looking into Lancer a little bit, and I think that falls pretty squarely into what I'm talking about, where there's a lot of customization and builds and stuff, and it's kind of all about making a cool build and playing with the game systems, and learning the game to try and win in that sort of sense. And not to say that it eschews is that how you say it? Eschews? Whatever. Not to say that it ignores any sort of fictional coherence, but that you can tell kind of when reading it that, like, game balance is extremely important, particularly in combat, for what the game designers had in mind. Compared to, and there's a lot of rules in terms of that. Not necessarily that it's like a rule for everything, but that there is clearly, like, everything's balanced around, like, action economy and stuff like that. And so those types of games, you want to know the system before you start homebrewing stuff, because you could accidentally easily break them, because they're supposed to be, if the designers have done their job, they're very tightly balanced games, and that's kind of part of the fun of them. Whereas on the OSR side of things, you tend to have a lot fewer rules, for starters, and advocates for the OSR, I think, would tend to say that's good because it gives you more player freedom and more agency. That's a video for a different time, but my teaser for another video, if I ever get around to making it, is that freedom and agency are not the same thing. But we don't have time for that. The OSR mindset or not the mindset, but the design philosophy of, let's have fewer rules here so that, and much more, that's a game design philosophy that's much more compatible with the rulings over rules thing, though I don't think that's exclusive to the OSR, that sort of thought process. But neither of these I find particularly satisfying. I think they both have their own pros and cons. And as always, it depends, like, what you want out of a game is what your design philosophy, what one design philosophy will be better at than another. But the pros, of course, as I kind of hinted at for, like, the 4E gamist, is that you've got a very tightly built game that it's a lot of fun to go through and, like, build your character and see how you can beat the system, sort of, or at least it's kind of a combat as sport mentality, and it's fun to play sports. Is kind of the simplest way I could put that. Whereas the OSR, of course, has a lot more freedom. And the 4E thing, like I said, you don't really want to tinker with that too much. Whereas the OSR, I would humbly submit, the downside to that is that you have to tinker with everything, that you're not going to get a lot of support. And I think this is more of a problem than some people might realize. And I suspect part of that blind spot comes from the fact that it's the old school Renaissance. That is, we have a generation of people who are very practiced in running these games. They've developed a style and a voice and a tradition. And so, with respect, it might be the case that they just don't remember what it's like to be a new guy. And I barely remember what it's like to be a new guy. And I definitely haven't been running games as long as a lot of the people out there. So, in a rule book which gets out of your way as a GM feels nice when you've already got the muscle memory, so to speak, to be a GM. When you already have all your tips and tricks and you know what kind of game you want to run, and that's cool. But I think it is not as practical when you want to either, first off, do something new, even if you are practiced. If you want to start running a different style, that's if all you've run is dungeon crawls, and I'm not saying every OSR guy only runs dungeon crawls, but as an example, if you've only run dungeon crawls, or like 90% of the games you've run are dungeon crawls, and then you want to suddenly start running mystery games, you're probably only as good as like the same guy that just started out. Like, some skills are going to be transferable for sure. I shouldn't say that you're only as good as the guy starting out, but you're much more comparable to a guy who's just starting, whose first GMing experience is a mystery game, compared to someone who has run mystery games for 20, 30 years. Because some skills really aren't transferable between the two. There is a big difference between some styles of games. And I think sometimes that goes underappreciated. But really, what I would like to see rulebooks do, and the reason I call it a toolbox, is that when I'm sitting down, one thing that I think is really good about rulings over rules, that sort of mindset, is the idea of, like, at the table, what's helpful for me, and flipping through a bunch of pages to figure out stuff, to figure out like one really specific edge case and how to adjudicate that is not practical. It's annoying. That is never someone's favorite part of playing an RPG. We're in agreement with that. However, if I want to suddenly set up a dramatic scene, like, say, so you're taken into the police station and they're interrogating you. What should that scene look like? What is the drama in the scene? What are the pitfalls? What are the pros and cons? Should I have roles? What do the roles mean in this scene? Now, again, maybe if you're like super practiced GM, you've developed a sort of instinct for what's dramatic and what isn't. And so you'd be prepared to just hop into this and everything will be good. Awesome for you. I suspect many GMs wouldn't be able to figure out exactly what to do from here. And some guidance would be helpful. So what I would want from a toolbox style rule book, because I'm really aiming less so on how a GM should run a game and more talking about how designers should design games. And when you're writing a rule book, I think it would be more useful to have a relatively flexible system, but there to still be a system. This is where some of my disagreement with OSR design philosophy comes in, because I'm overgeneralizing and I could be wrong. Feel free to tell me if I'm wrong, and where exactly I'm wrong. But I think that there is a tendency among OSR design philosophy to just be like, get out of the way. Just get out of the way. Less rules is better. And it's like, well, I think we can do better than that. I think there is a superior design philosophy, and I think the superior design philosophy for most situations, honestly, usually I'm pretty limited in saying like I'm trying to qualify like when something is better or worse. And to be fair, this is probably still true here, but I still think having some sort of toolbox would be more beneficial than just saying like, oh, make a ruling GM. So what do I mean by toolbox? Because I've been dancing around this for like 15 minutes now. What do I mean by toolbox? Well, what I mean is a system. There is some sort of system, but it should be relatively simple, flexible, modular, and all of those things. It should be so that the GM can quickly and easily tailor it to the situation. Those are two very important things. First off, it has to be simple and easy, because a GM has to remember this on the fly. So it cannot be like a super complicated and nuanced noodly thing. It has to be something that they can break out and understand thoroughly so that they can then tailor it to the situation at hand. And tailoring to the situation at hand is also very important, because if you've just got like a universal system that you do for every single thing is going to start to feel exactly the same. So it has to be customizable, but it also has to be simple. A tall order, I know. But one very simple way to do this in a lot of different things is something like a skill challenge or a success tracker, depending on, and you can have various flavors of these things, but you say you need to get a certain number of successes within a certain number of roles. I tend to prefer dice pool systems, so I can literally roll a bunch of dice and then count the number of successes and then put them on the tracker, so I can say, aha, you've got 3 out of the 10 necessary successes that you need. And then you have to figure out some sort of pressure mechanic, like why can't I keep rolling forever for it? So maybe it's a flat like number of attempts that you have. Maybe there is, I've been fiddling with the idea of having like almost a saving throw, where it's like you do one roll to add to the success tracker, and then there's another roll that you can only fail so many times before, all right, you're done. There's some problems with that idea, but I'm not going to go into detail right now because I want to talk about the idea, the general principle of toolbox. But the point is, okay, why do I like something like this easier? Well, success tracker, that's easy enough to remember. It's just like, how many successes do you need? And then you have some sort of limiting factor. And now I can apply that to a social situation. How much convincing do I need before I run out of my credibility? Draw Steel has something vaguely similar to that idea, as I kind of referenced before. But it could also be like, oh, if I'm climbing a mountain, this is how much progress I have to make before I run out of my endurance, or something like that. And if it's flexible enough, you can say, here are some optional rules that you can have on it. Only include them when it's applicable for given things. And so this is, I think, more useful than the very simple D&D-esque, like, oh, we've got skills and stuff. It's like, yeah, but that's pass-fail. If you include crit fail and crit success, technically those are degrees of success, but it tends to be sort of one roll and you resolve it. And the problem with that is you're not actually building a dramatic scene. You're just having a moment. So fleshing that out into more of a skill challenge is one way to turn it into a dramatic moment rather than a dramatic beat. But these are things that I think you should pursue, different kinds of dramatic scenes. And if you don't agree with that, if you think like, no, these things should only be dramatic beats, I really want to pick your brain about combat and what you think about combat. And because my question would be, okay, why don't we have combat resolve in a single roll? You could do that. It's not an invalid design philosophy. If I was making a horror game, for example, where the idea is you're not supposed to fight the monsters, that's probably what I would do for combat. I'd say you make one roll, and if you lose, you die. Because I don't want the players to fight the monsters. I want them to be scared of the monsters. To be fair, I could also write in a rule like, you can try to fight the monsters, but just describe what you do, and then the GM will say you don't succeed. But personally, I kind of like the idea of having like a single combat roll. You lose, you die, just to kind of emphasize, like, technically you can try. But so my point is that it's not an invalid design philosophy to say one roll combat, but most people, I think, who play RPGs probably aren't a big fan of that idea. And why aren't they a big fan of that idea? Because combat is fun. We like to play out the combat and see how the drama unfolds in there. And again, there's various philosophies on like where the fun of combat is. You could have a more dire, tactical but dire situation where a single bad roll could kill you. I personally tend to be over that sort of thing, but that's again another sort of story. Or you could have more of the combat as sport, as I was talking about before. But either way, there is some drama, and getting into some level of detail about the drama is entertaining. And I think that same principle holds true for a lot of other types of scenes. If I'm being interrogated by the cops in a room here, I think there is some fun drama to be had. And if that's reduced down to, oh, make a deception roll to see if they believe you, that's anticlimactic. Now, again, like I've said previously, you could have a very experienced GM or someone who's got like really good dramatic instincts in the sense of like characters interacting, and they could improv a fantastic interrogation scene, and just every once in a while, you know, when their dramatic instincts tell them it's appropriate, say, all right, now you need to roll deception, now you need to roll charisma, and they can wing it and it'll be great and perfect. Most of us aren't that person. I'm not that person. So in that situation, having some sort of guidance to say, here's a tool where you can make this interrogation scene dramatic, that would be much more helpful to me than just going, well, figure it out, Skippy. And there could be a couple of different tools, though generally speaking, I would say the fewer tools, you want a tool that's simple to understand, but that can be modified in a number of ways. Now, another popular thing, particularly in the OSR, is to say we want player skill over character skill. And that might be something someone would say to me to rebut this idea of like a toolbox, because it's still too much of just like, oh, you make some rolls and you succeed. And to be clear, I'm not trying to say like just roll and instead of one roll to succeed the scene, you make several rolls to succeed the scene. That's not what I'm talking about. Player input still matters. But I kind of disagree with, this is one, I said rulings over rules, pretty good principle. I just think it needs a little bit of refinement. But I actually kind of disagree with player skill over character skill, because I think it's a false dichotomy. Because I'm not saying character skill over player skill before someone thinks they know what I'm saying. I'm saying player skill, character skill, yes. Both are valuable. The question isn't one over the other or which one's better. The question is, where do you apply each? And to return to the combat example, both are present. Because guess what? You don't do player skill for how well you swing the sword and whether or not you hit the bad guy. That's character skill. What's their attack bonus? Roll the die and see if they beat the AC. That's pure character skill. But there is an expression of player skill in there, and generally the expression of player skill is tactics. So the moment to moment is the character skill, but the overall, there's room for the input for player skill. And that's generally how I think it should happen. So for social scenes, for example, I think you can pretty much use this for most RPGs. I'd be shocked if there's an RPG that doesn't let you do the following. But what I tend to do when I have a social situation is that I say, okay, tell me what your character is going to say. Based on that, I'm going to adjust the difficulty for this roll, the DC, how many successes you need, whatever the case is. And then we roll for whatever the skill is that the character is rolling. And so that's a little bit of both in there. Now, I have a lot more thoughts on how social skills and scenes should be made, but again, that's going to be an entirely different diatribe that we can't get into now. But So yeah, there's room for, I want there to always be room for player skill as well. But the reason that I think the toolbox framework is better is because it does allow for that if it's made carefully. So I already kind of explained how you might do that in a social situation, but another possible way that you might have a toolbox be useful is that, for instance, if I'm rolling a bunch of extra successes to add to the tracker, maybe I can choose not to add some to the tracker, but I can use those to give bonuses to my fellow players, or I can, if I keep the save idea, I can, keep those to make the save a little bit easier. That's actually the problem I was thinking of earlier, is that that might be too overpowered, because if you can just keep winning the save, then basically you can do this ad infinitum, at which point I'm sapping the drama. So I did side tangent a little bit. That's one way that I might have to adjust it. But the idea is there's a tactical thing that you could do there. Now, more realistically, I'd prefer if you're directly interacting with the fiction as well. And let's keep in mind, too, that when I say there's another aspect to the toolbox approach, is that this is actually really important, and I should have brought it up earlier. The toolbox is here to be used if the GM needs it. It isn't rules. This is another part of the toolbox, tool over rule, which is you're not supposed to just grab this framework and slavishly apply it and stick to it no matter what. The point is, if you need it, GM, you who's running the game right now, do you need a dramatic backbone for your scene? Here's a tool. Here's how you could run the interrogation session. You don't actually need to follow it precisely to the left. Instead, if you're like doing like a persuasion, sorry. If you're doing like a persuasion thing and someone says the perfect line for what to convince someone, cool, then just rule it. They succeed. They do it. Or if they say something really good, you can give them some automatic successes. You don't need to just you don't need to say like, oh, the rule book says this. No. This is if there's the maybe. A really good bit of advice that was actually in the Star Trek Adventures 2nd edition rule book was like, player tries something. If you think it would succeed, it succeeds. If you think it would fail, it fails. It's only maybe that you bring out the rules for. And that's exactly what I'm saying. It's like, hey, if you've got maybe this would work, consider this rule. Would this rule be helpful in that situation? If it's helpful, use it. If it's not, don't use it. And, feel free to bend on the fly and adjust things as necessary. That's a very important part, and that's very much sort of the part of rulings over rules that I definitely agree with. So if someone does something in the fictional universe that makes sense, like I don't care that they have 6 successes that they need to accumulate beforehand, according to my tracker rule. They just did the perfect thing, They dropped a giant boulder on the villain's head. He's dead. I don't care about the fact that supposedly there was a bunch more successes they needed. No, you succeeded. Good job. And that's generally how I would prefer to run combat as well. Even though it might have sounded like I was singing some of the praises for like some of the 4E gamist stuff. And they're fun in their own way. I do generally like to have some flexibility in there and to have unorthodox solutions. But this is also, my final note is also on the idea of when to employ these things. Not only is it just like the maybe this will work or maybe this wasn't, but I've mentioned before, like, if you want to make a dramatic scene. And so the important part about that is the scene dramatic that you need to grab for the rules? Because don't grab for rules just because they might apply. Grab for rules that will add drama to the situation. So, for example, I mentioned like climbing before. Just because a character is climbing something doesn't mean that you have to use the suggestion for climbing rules. Like, if it just happens to be part of the adventure, we're climbing a mountain here, okay, but we're just going from point A to point B, and that's not the main part of the adventure. We don't actually need to roll to climb this. But if you're playing Mission Impossible 4, and the guy playing Tom Cruise is trying to climb the Burj Khalifa as part of this massive heist, that's a great time to suddenly have climbing rules where you can have failures, and that'll add to the drama and the tension of the situation. In contrast, if you're playing Mission Impossible 2, why? I'm sorry for your players if you're doing that. But if you're playing Mission Impossible 2 and you're just having an intro sequence where the Tom Cruise player is looking cool and climbing some rocks because he's that cool, don't break out the climbing rules. All you're going to do is make that player annoyed that their guy just slipped on some rocks. Thanks so much. Even though I've got all the climbing skills, now I just feel like a jackass. So that's something as well to keep in mind, is the toolbox approach is not supposed to be, it's not about designing a simulation for the world. It's not about trying to tell you win this, then this. No, it's like, hey, do you need to spice up a given scene to add drama and you weren't prepared for this ahead of time? Here's something that you can quickly grab. So again, it's got to be relatively simple so a GM can remember it and employ it at the table when they need. It should still be modifiable and flexible. Like, there could be some rules that you do use and some rules that you don't use necessarily, so long as you can keep them in your head. But you can choose, like, hey, this is a situation where I do want to have saves, or this is a situation where, no, it's going to be a strict time limit, or actually, in this situation, there's an opponent that can remove successes, or not. Or you can do the same role over and over again, or you can't do the same role over and over again. I think those are relatively simple, that you could remember that those are options that you could or could not use depending on the situation. But again, flexible. And then, of course, like the number of successes that you might need, or the difficulty to the save, or the number of turns that you have, whatever the case may be, those are different tools that the GM can change and modify, so that not only you could have 2 climbing challenges that are entirely different, or 2 persuasions that are very different, but also that persuasion doesn't feel like climbing. And that's a little bit tricky. But if they're all working on the same basic situation or basic system, then that should be something that a GM can do. And actually, I forgot, I did have one other point about the character skill, which is that if I make a character who's good at something, having a system means that he can be good at that. If I make a character who's supposed to be really good at climbing or really good at deception, for example, and I wind up with the GM who's like, no, I want you to tell me how you climb the rock, or I want you to tell me how you deceive him. Like, to a degree, to like tell me how you deceive him, like, I'm like, yeah, you probably should tell him how you deceive him. But having someone who's more convincing, it helps to actually be able to play out that fantasy. Because that's, I think, an important part of the role-playing game is, hey, I want to play a character who isn't like me. I want to play a character who has skills in this world that I don't have in the real world. And by having a system like this, where, for example, if you've got a bigger dice pool in, like, deception, for example, hey, my character can do this. Now, if I tell a stupid lie as a player character, it's like, okay, you've got a really high difficulty for that, but go ahead and roll your stupidly large pool of dice. We'll see how well that works out. But it gives you a little bit of, it gives you some padding. It gives you some, I don't like the word padding. It's not about compensating necessarily for lack of player skill, but it is about giving another avenue for expression and escapism. And I think that's important. So, simplicity, flexibility / modularity, an avenue for escapism, and I think those are the main 3 ideas. So I agree. We don't want to have a rule book that you have to look up every single very specific nitty-gritty example and edge case, but we also, I think, we can create drama engines so that we don't have to have, like, GM suddenly deer in the headlights look of like, oh, this is supposed to be an important moment, but I don't know what to do. It might not result in 10 out of 10 role-playing moments, but hopefully it will mean that it doesn't spiral into 2 out of 10 moments.